Welcome, guys. This is the Creative File podcast, and I'm your host today, Onion Yabor. Yay! So, quick introduction. The Creative File podcast, we're just talking about what are the best ways to be creative, how do we set ourselves up to get in the flow while creating. And I'm actually going to be doing that, a demonstration with a little project on myself, where I'm going to be going over my magnum opus, a story, a book that I've wanted to write for a while, and talking to you guys through that process, just through each of the episodes through the first season. And we're going to talk about what that process looks like, how you can finish what it is you want to do, how you can actually get your books done and actually write them and stop messing around, and actually be the writer you're meant to be. And I've had a lot of experience doing this. So I was a writer coach for I've been a writer coach for about 3 or 4 years now, and I took about a year off to really come to terms with some things that I'd realized about the nature of reality and just how to really help and support people, because it was important to me that people were able to succeed and do well. And so a lot of what I've been doing and experimenting with is just understanding how do people actually create results in life, and not just writers or authors, but other creatives, and specifically people who work in business fields, who work in economics, and who are just making a big difference. And like I said, it's really about just creating something, right? So if you're a writer, if you're a musician, if you're an artist, if you're a business person, if you're an architect, I don't really care. This podcast will help you understand how you can better step into the full version of yourself, be a more supportive, contributive artist and member of society, and hopefully figure out how to get paid while doing it. That's the most important thing here, because we want to be able to sustain and live our lives as we're meant to be. So that's what we're doing here. That is the vibe, and that is what I'm shooting for. So I guess before we start, I just want to encourage you to take a moment and follow, like, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. So this will be on YouTube, Spotify, the works. It really helps the show grow, and it means I can bring on more incredible guests to show our creative journey together. So go ahead and hit that follow button right now, as well as if you're interested in being featured on the podcast, there should be a link, especially on YouTube, to be able to submit questions, and in that form you can also apply to be on the podcast. We have some guests coming up throughout the weeks, and so I'm super excited about that. But anyway, we'll start with me, and who am I? So my name is Onion Yabor, English name Jeffrey Uday, and I guess I just want to talk about my creative journey, right? So I was born in Salt Lake City, Utah, and I was not Mormon, which is a big deal. If you're from Utah, there's a lot of Mormons there, or members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and that's going to be a big theme. And I remember growing up, they had these commercials where they would say, "Family, isn't it about time?" And they were really influential ads, and so I always had a really positive opinion of the church, and I really don't have anything nasty to say about it, though there's a whole lot to say. That's a topic for another day. What I really want to talk about is just my story and how I got into writing, how I became a creative, and how I went from basically this kid who was, kind of left aside, to actually being able to write a few books, help others do the same, and, just doing what I do, and now sitting here talking to you through this device so that we can connect. I guess it would start, the real big stuff is when I was 13 years old, I suppose, because growing up, I always had a lot of different experiences. I loved Japanese anime, and it was interesting. So if you can't see me physically, I'm a black man, right? And I don't really sound like it. I don't sound like Tyrone or Jamal. I'm just Oni. But in Utah, when I was growing up in the 90s, they had a lot of white people, and the white people did not like people who weren't white and Mormon. And I was not white, and I was not Mormon. And so I kind of got treated pretty badly, and I didn't realize why until I was a lot older. And the big change happened when I kind of was living a life or whatever, just kind of being a random kid. And there's so much to go into, but let's get to the juicy part. When I was about 13, I went into foster care. There was a bunch of stuff going on at home. And while I was there, I really came to terms with the fact that I this is the first time I realized that not everybody thought the same things, right? And that people had very different experiences. I'd always known that growing up, but I think I'd never really been exposed to other family cultures or been around other people. I'd only ever known my mom and my brother. And when I was in foster care, that was the first time like I'd actually spend time living with somebody else and seeing like, oh wow, like these kids had very different upbringings and they had very different homes and there's just different standards of living. And that was the very first time I'd ever experienced anything like that. It was really wild for me. And it got even crazier because after foster care of 6 months or so, that summer I was sent to boarding school in Canada, in Victoria, British Columbia. And so while living in Victoria, that was the first time I would say I was really treated like a human being, because I was going to a school that had a bunch of Asian kids. So kids from like Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong. There was a few Japanese kids. It was the first time that I lived in such a diverse environment. So there was also Canadian kids. There were kids from India. But in spite of all that, that was the first time where, even though I was the only black kid in the school, and that was a big deal, especially because gangster rap and, you know, G Unit was a really big deal. And there was a lot of societal expectations for me to act and be a certain way, which I just wasn't. I was a very nerdy, kind of socially awkward kid who didn't have like a lot of social skills. And I was definitely like lopsided. I'll say, looking back on myself, I was definitely on the maladaptive spectrum. If there's a spectrum for people who didn't quite figure it out when they were younger, I was definitely on that spectrum, no doubt. And so I think to kind of more situate and, I don't know, find my own niche, even though I played video games and computer games, especially Warcraft 3 with a really good friend of mine, I really caught on to basketball. And basketball was a really enlightening experience for me because it was the first time I was able to do something that people accepted me and validated me for, because being black, playing basketball was socially acceptable. Doing math and watching anime wasn't, but playing basketball as a black man, I was allowed to do that, and people kind of left me alone. But it was also the first time I really felt this sense of self-improvement. I think there's a lot of times I'd wanted to get better at things, but my mom, bless her heart, really did not like me to improve at things. Looking back on it, I do realize that maybe without knowing it, she was inordinately focused on sabotaging my efforts to improve myself. I think just because maybe it was a threat to her or whatever. She's got a lot of her own issues, but she really did her best, so there's no harm there. But one of the things I saw was like being able to be in that environment free from her and being able to play basketball and really being able to develop myself. I saw that, oh wow, I can improve at something because I was able to jump higher. And I remember in ninth grade playing and not being very good, practicing, and there was this one kid, he was this Korean kid, Kevin Ha, and he came back and I played, and I remember he looked at me and he said, man, you really improved. And I remember that was like the most validating thing. Even to this day, I still think of him saying that to me, where I was like, oh, you really improved. And I was like, yeah, I did. So I got really obsessed with basketball, and it was like my dream. And my favorite basketball player was Dwayne Wade. And he was the total G. I love Dwayne Wade. Um, but I never got to see him play. And so I had a lot of hoop dreams, even though I was 5'9" and 3/4, and I was athletic, but I'd started pretty late. And so being that small, you have to be pretty skilled. And I had plans to play in college, but there was just so many things that didn't go my way. I think I was honestly looking back now and understanding the mechanics of the universe as I do. I realized I so much of why I was playing basketball was because I was ashamed of being who I really was. So basketball was always going to be an inauthentic expression of who I was because I was doing it for the approval of others and sort of like as a safety shelter. And the reality is even though I love basketball now and I really enjoy it, the reality is I had hoop dreams because it was an easy thing to tell people, and I thought that's what they wanted me to hear. But in reality, like, I wanted to build like giant space lasers and video games and movies, and I even started writing a book when I was in high school, but some kids made fun of me, and so I stopped it. And I just had this habit of always starting things and never finishing things. It was constant. Like, I remember there was a documentary I was going to do, and then there was this book or whatever. And the first time I actually started something and completed things was like way later in my life. And it took a long time to get to that point. And basketball was for the first time I found something that I was actually improving at. But it was a lot of frustration. And so eventually what happened is I moved back to Utah, which was awful. I am not a fan of that place. Even though it's where I was born, I do not consider it home in the least bit. Like, you'll never find text to me being like, I love this place. It's just I'm not a fan of the place. But after getting kicked out of my house, so I moved back in with my mother, and obviously I was in foster care for a reason, and then I got sent to Canada. So even though it was 4.5 years later, 5 years, I still got kicked out of my house, and I was living in my car. And I'd gotten a job, I was living in an apartment, and I can go into all the details of that story where I was bouncing from place to place, and it was a really cold winter, had a job, lost my job, was struggling to pay rent, and it was like one of the hardest times of my life. But while I was living in that, I had this dream about this girl and a king. And I didn't know it at the time, but this was the beginnings of what would be the first thing I ever really wrote to completion, which was The Wind of the Ways. And that's the project that I'm going to be starting, the sort of magnum opus. And the full vision of it came when I met up with a friend. So what had happened is I got kicked out of my house, and then like 6 months after that winter or whatever, my grandmother died, and my mom, having an existential crisis, asked me to come back in, even though I was actually going to go start selling alarm systems in the South. I think I was going to go to like Louisiana or Mississippi to go do it with this one place, and I was going to go start knocking door to door because I had no money. And looking back on it, I think that probably wouldn't have been the better move. But my mom, as clever as she is, she bribed me with a semester of school, which she did end up paying for. She didn't follow through with some other things, but she bribed me with a semester of school. She said she'd pay 1 semester of school if I moved back in, because she was just feeling existential dread because her mother passing. And when I moved back in, I remember I was helping my mother take care of some things on the lawn, and a friend came out to help me, and we were there killing weeds on the lawn. And I just told him this whole story about this dream I had about a boy with some wind rattling on the windows. And this boy woke up to this wind passing through the windows, and that was the beginning of The Wind of the Ways, and that's the book I'm writing. And it was one of the most influential dreams of my life. And since then, I'd had very, very vivid dreams, but this was the big one. This is the one that really set it apart in motion for me. Anyway, so with that in mind, I wanted to talk about now with that part of the story, right before we continue, I guys wanted to talk about you guys and your dreams. So, from wanting to write this book and really get it out there, it only took a little bit after writing in my journal and working on this book to realize that I sucked and that I was terrible at it. And even though I was probably better than some, I still had a long way to go. And writing's tough, man. And so I felt that if I kept writing, I was going to spoil the story. And at the time, I was working at UPS, and I came to my mind that I needed to just start working on something else. And at the time, I was a big comic book fan, right? And so this is when Marvel had just come out with their reading comic books online. But this is before Disney had bought Marvel. That should tell you guys, for some of the other people, this should put you in perspective how much of an unk I am, right? And so I was reading Marvel comic books online, and I fell in love with X-23. And from X-23 and reading a bunch of X-Men comic books, I read so many. I read like a ton of the Uncanny X-Men, the New Mutants, X-Men, just X-Men original. I read obviously a ton of Spider-Man. And I was also read the Civil War comics, which were really big at the time before the movies had come out, before it had been really popular. And, I was a Marvel OG, by the way. I saw Marvel and Disney merging years before it happened, because I was obsessed with Disney princesses and Marvel, and now they're together, which is kind of weird. But anyway, after keeping this journal and working on it, I had an existential crisis where some things happened with my brother, and so he and I decided to move out from my mother and I, and so we were living in an apartment. And while there, he had become LDS, and I wasn't really a big fan of the religion at the time, but I was really big on enforcing and helping people live up to their standards. And so I was supporting my brother in living that, and him being LDS, and he had a home teacher. And if you guys have ever been around LDS people, they're super pushy, and they like to turn everybody into projects. And so I got turned into a project by a few people, who are kind of pretending to be my friend. But, you get turned into a project, and then before you know it, you're a member of the church, and that's just kind of how it works, right? But it was still, once again, zero regrets. I think joining the LDS church was one of the best decisions I ever made. During that time, I was keeping a journal, really coming to terms with like my storytelling and understanding the depths of story. I was making relationships, and there's just a lot going on with me. And so I actually decided to move to Portland, Oregon, following an intuition that I felt. And so I just got in my car and moved to Portland at the end of the year. And my brother moved back in with my mother, and I was trying to figure out God and find out who he was. So I just moved to Portland, Oregon. And while I was up there, I found myself going to a congregation, and it totally changed my life. I was having all these spiritual experiences. I was gaining all these insights. And this was the first time my mind really started tapping into this idea that God operated with law. This is going to be a really big theme later. But it was the very first time that I was like, oh, God operates with laws. And if you understand God's laws, you can understand sort of the logic of religion, the universe, and how things are made. Now, at the time, I recognized that I didn't know the laws. I didn't know what any of these laws were. But I recognized that there was law and that they were present. And so I kind of set out to understand these laws. And I didn't quite have a full grasp of them, but for what little I was learning, I started to see that, wow, in fact, I'm actually making progress. And there's some real juice behind all this stuff I'm learning. And so after being a member of the church, having